Marlon Brando has been called the top screen actor of his time. He's appeared in about 30 movies. He accepted an Oscar for On the Waterfront in 1955. He refused an Oscar in 1972 for The Godfather as a means of protesting against the way that, in his view, Hollywood had misportrayed the American Indian. He's also accepted as one of the great stage actors of our time, particularly for his performance in A Streetcar Named Desire, 1947. In addition to all of that, Mr. Brando is a social activist. He has been active in many causes, most recently the cause of the American Indian. I think it's clear that being an actor and being known as an actor is not sufficient for you. It is sufficient for many other people. Why is it not for you?
I'd rather be known as an actor than a social activist, because somehow being a social activist sort of categorizes you. And I don't know, Ed, whether you're familiar with a book called An Inquiry into the Human Prospect.
Mm-hmm.
And that stood whatever hair is left on my head straight on end, because it spelled out very specifically what the nature of the apocalypse is, how long it's going to take, and I think dealt very coolly and very sensibly with the issue of overpopulation and human aggression, political issues, and the use of raw materials. And it made clear that, for instance, if China were to use raw materials at the rate that we use raw materials, it would all be over in about 15 years. And so we don't realize that. And so when people refer to you as a social activist, which I suppose is, for a better phrase we haven't perhaps yet found, we all have to be social activists if we want to survive on the planet. We might have 138 nations, or 134, whatever it is today, but it's only one planet. So all these problems seem sort of piddling, but if we don't solve them, we're not going to be speaking freely. We're not going to be speaking at all.
Well, maybe what is involved here is a certain element of surprise that an actor would do what you do.
Hey, you haven't been reading the newspaper?
You mean about you?
No, about Mr. Reagan. He, I suppose he broke the ice. No, George Murphy did, Mr. Tap Dancer. And, but Reagan went on and sort of made the segue into politics. But I think actors have always been in the forefront. I think people in the business have been called upon to do a number of things that other people haven't done, bond issues and stuff like that.
Well, I don't mean to say anything unkind about either Ronald Reagan or George Murphy as actors, but nobody would consider them actors in the same sense that Marlon Brando is considered an actor. As an actor, you can, for years past, anything would have been open to you. You could have done anything you pleased. Yet you didn't spend by any means all your time acting, or come even close to it. And obviously there was something there that wasn't sufficient for you. Whereas there is something there, as I was saying earlier, that is sufficient for most people in that field. Is there something in acting that doesn't satisfy you, or has not for a long time past?
Well, I guess the only thing I remember from geometry class was that the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. And I think that's true of society as well. And if we don't, as individuals, make whatever contribution we can, as we see it, then it's not going to be much of a society, and the fabric is going to be wear rather thin rather quickly. I think, as we've seen, we've sort of started out perhaps with a pretty good idea, and we've come to where we are now. I think largely because people haven't taken an interest. The polls have indicated that people are not participating. Only the people that really are participating now are either the moneyed people who want a lot more money, or the poor people who want a lot less poverty, and the people who have been disenfranchised, and such as the Indian.
Has this been a view of yours for a long time?
Yes, I rather resented the fact that I was not allowed in this country that tells me that I'm free and that intellectual investigation is the sine qua non of the best that a nation can offer its people, the educational system did not provide me with the necessary information to find out that this country was built on the blood and bones of another race, and that we were many times saved by these people in the ups and downs in the early parts of formation of this country by American Indians, that we adopted many of their political principles. I think the greatest amount taken from the Iroquoian Federation. And what I read in the history books has nothing to do with the actual history. I suppose I could sit here and ask you what the Dawes Act is, and you wouldn't know. I could ask you what was the significant feature, or what was the significant change and profound occasion that took place in 1830, and you wouldn't know that either. And it's not because I wish to exercise the fact that I know it and you don't, and make that impression that you didn't have an opportunity to learn it, nor did I, until I started reading about Indian history. And of course I feel largely responsible because my community did nothing at all to assist in correcting that error, and as a matter of fact it went all the way the other way in distorting it. And what people know about Indians is largely due to what Hollywood has said and what the myth that has been created as a result of movies having been made about Indians.
When you went to Hollywood, well, at first you resisted going to Hollywood, did you not? There is a quote from you in which you say they've never made an honest film in Hollywood in their lives. Do you remember saying that very early in your career?
I might have said anything. I can't remember where I left my car yesterday. But I think it's a safe assumption, relatively speaking. I think there have been guys like Stanley Kramer who have certainly tried to do their very best, and Orson Welles' production of Citizen Kane is never to be forgotten. And I think there have been Martin Scorsese's film, for instance, I think remarkable. There have been many, many attempts, and I think many successes in Hollywood. But I don't know that that's...
Well, we'll go back to what I asked you at the beginning. I'm beginning to think I'm not going to get very far with this question. You said you would rather be known as an actor than a social activist because it was necessary.
That was just... I was being facetious.
For everybody to be socially active, in your view. But has acting been a satisfying career for you?
It's been a means to an end, but I think that we see every day, or we refuse to see every day, as the case may be, that the world is shrinking and that problems arise which, if we don't solve, we simply cannot exist on the planet. And I think the problem in this country, in terms of, I suppose, microcosmically, is that a good word, Ed?
I hesitate to have an opinion.
Is it okay to say that?
We'll let it go. You're my guest.
I was telling Ed before that I wasn't so terrified of speaking freely so much as speaking correctly since I read your book, or started to read it. And in any event, we have, if we looked at a map and looked at the successive maps of the United States from the time the Spanish arrived here, some 400 years ago, it was all Indian-owned. And then we look at the map today and we see tiny little concentrated enclaves of areas that are known to be submarginal or marginal lands. And somehow we don't feel responsible in any way, shape, or form for the fact that we have destroyed a people, that in order to build this great nation, as we describe ourselves and as the rhetoric goes, we have had to destroy a people. And now that these people are getting off one knee, because they never were down all the way, peculiar thing, in conjunction with this investigation of Indian affairs, I've had occasion to look at related subjects. And one of the things that came up recently was the fact that when you have language, when you have religion, when you have land in a controllable area, when you have custom and law, you have the basic elements that are necessary to make any society cohesive. And the United States government has long thought, well, we'll destroy the Indians and we will change them, and of course we did everything we could. We murdered them when we had to, when it was just simply a question of bullets and arrows. And then when that became not economical, because it cost quite a lot of money to kill one Indian, I think, I read the figures once, I think it was $11,000 per Seminole. I'm not quite sure of that figure, but became astronomical. Then when we were able to divest them of their military power, not outfought, but simply outgunned, and just wave after wave of military might fell upon the Indians and broke their capacity to militarily resist the United States. But there were many tribes, such as the Seminole and such as Geronimo, who never gave up, who never surrendered, and who never made any kind of capitulation. But then after that, of course, we made treaties with the Indians. And the treaty is such a sanctified document and such a respected contract that we have in the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution said, in fact, that treaties are the law of the land, and that all officers of the courts are obliged to uphold those treaties. Now, somehow we've managed to twist that around. Judge Urbaum recently, in his decision in Nebraska, completely backed away from it and said it is not up to the judicial to uphold the respect of those documents. It is up to the legislatures. Well, the legislatures get together, as we well know, and just draw up a paper and say, Al, do you like this? This is pretty good stuff. What about you, Ralph? Huh? Anybody say, good, okay, we'll make it into a law. And it's a law that provides anything. Congress can pass the most ridiculous kind of laws, the most punishing kind of laws, the most immoral kind of laws, and just simply call it a law. As a case in point, the Gold Hill, or the Black Hills of the Sioux, was by treaty to be respected by the United States government. The United States government sent surveyors in there, and they found gold. So they thought, oh boy, we got some trouble now, because we got a whole lot of gold in the Black Hills, and how are we going to get it? Well, how much gold is there? So they sent people in there to find out how much gold, and they found there was quite a bit of shekels in there. Then the treaty, of course, provided for no cessation of land, no giving up of land by the Sioux Nation unless it was signed by 3/4 of the male population. That was before women's liberation movement. And you didn't laugh, Ed.
I smirked. I'm not on camera.
Anyway, you mean you only smirk on camera?
I always smirk on camera.
I see. Anyway, the fact is that they went in and lied and cheated and forged and got roughly 10% of the the male nations, the male Sioux, to sign that. Well, they brought it back to Congress, and it was not satisfactory. So they said, well, it's good enough. 10's just as good as 75. And so they wrote it into law and took the Black Hills. And, of course, that touched off the Great War, in which many people were killed. But that's typical of the kind of thing the American government has done. The American people don't care. It's out of sight, out of mind. And returning to the issue of cohesiveness, which I spoke of before, I'm amazed to find that the Jews, after having left the Holy Land and after the diaspora and the spreading out, did not retain their Hebraic language. They spoke the language of the country they went to, whether it was Spain or Germany or Russia or wherever it was. And there was later on in the development of Yiddish, which became the common tongue, which is a bastard form of German. And the Jews had neither land nor citizenship. They couldn't control law to a large extent. They had none of the cohesive features. They had religion and they had culture. They didn't even have language. And but the Jewish people have contributed more to the culture of the world than any other single group. I don't know why that is, and I've asked many people that. I think briefly we discussed that on the phone. But that's an amazing phenomenon. But whatever it is, what it says, in fact, is that in spite of the erosion of these cultural features that keep people together, people have a way of staying together. Now, we had the melting pot notion here in America, and that we all were going to sort of be together. That is not that it is not, in fact, true of the American Indian. We are going to, I don't want to make this sound like a polemic, but there's so much to say and so little is known about it that I must correct a lot of misconceptions that people have about Indians. They are not going to join this great American society. This is their country, and they want it back, and there is a bill before Congress. Senator Aberest has been wise enough and brave enough and had enough perspicacity. How do you like that? Had enough insight to create this bill because he saw it coming. And rather than have people killed, rather than have us stand up like fools in front of the United Nations saying that we're interested in the third world people, that we do care, that we are concerned about the principles of freedom and the right of self-determination. That's the phrase that makes me weep. That we will send 50,000 people to Vietnam, millions blown up, killed, all for nothing. It's all coming down today because of right of self-determination. And Barry Goldwater's flaming rhetoric about the wonders of the United States insofar as it keeps its promises, whereas the communists do not. And that is so easily parried and can be thrust aside. Yes, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, what is in Senator Aberest's bill? What would it do? What would it provide?
Senator Aberest's bill asks the fatal question. What is it that we have done? What have we wrought as a nation? What must we do to correct it? It is a bill that is largely concerned with a very careful and precise re-examination of our Indian policy.
But suppose, for the sake of argument, you are in a position to say what ought to be done with some assurance that it would be followed, that your view would be taken seriously and perhaps accepted. What redress can you see now being performed? What acts of redress can you see being performed by the United States? What do you think should be done as a practical matter, given the condition of the country today, given the history of the last few hundred years? What can be done?
I must not make the mistake, as other people must not, to speak on behalf of the Indians or for the Indians in any way. Their spokesmen are most eloquent people, and the history of Indian oratory will attest to that. What we must do is to correct the wrongs that have been perpetrated against the Indians. They have been despoiled. They have been dispossessed of their lands. What we must do, in fact, is reinstate the Indians. We rebuilt Germany. We fought them to a standstill. We buried them at Dresden and Bremen and Danzig and Berlin. And we buried them under rubble. And then we thought the moral thing to do and the intelligent thing to do would be to rebuild Germany, to rebuild the Ruhr Valley. And that is something that we look to as one of the most laudable acts. Then, of course, we rebuilt Japan. And we promised North Vietnam if they would keep their nose clean enough and not make us look too bad and give a reasonable space of time before they came in and did what they're doing today, that we would send a lot of money to North Vietnam. We felt it incumbent upon us, I amongst them, to establish a state of Israel based on the precedent that they were there 2,000 years ago, as history will attest. But people coming from the camps and coming through the experience of Auschwitz and Belsen and the horrors of that had to have a place to go. And the Palestinian question aside, certainly something has to be arranged fairly about that to accommodate those people who were dispossessed. But the American government did feel that it was morally incumbent upon the United States to establish the state of Israel in the full sense of the word.
Where the Indians are concerned, then you're talking about more than money.
I'm talking about the reinstatement of a people, and I'm talking about the reinstatement of their sovereignty. The Indians, of course, realized that we're not all going to go back to Dublin or to Danzig or wherever it is we came from, that is just simply unfeasible. However, there is plenty of land in America, and I think roughly 95% of all the people in America live on 2% of the land. And there is plenty of land that the government owns. There are plenty of places where people go throw their beer cans and their gum wrappers around that could serve as an expansion of the land base. But we must reinstate them in the fullest sense of the word as a people. Otherwise, we're going to just continue to have these wars in the United States.
Let me insert what is, I suppose, a somewhat personal question in all of this. Do you find it difficult to have yourself taken seriously when you talk about these things because you have a reputation as an actor rather than as somebody who is experienced in the field of politics, let us say, public affairs?
Yeah, people that don't like you always say this: he's trying to get himself some publicity. And I think the news media knows full well what my stand on that issue is in respect to my personal life. I've never sought it, and there's no question about that. And they, it's sort of been a standoff, and they respect my view, and I respect theirs. But there are places where it does cross the line, such as in this issue. I don't need it. I just did The Godfather and The Last Tango in Paris, and I had, if I was interested, more publicity than I could possibly use. And it's of no interest to me whatsoever. But it is an interest to me, of mine, because I, in some respects, because I have 5 children. And those children are going to grow up in a world that is vastly different. I asked you one time over the phone if you were not concerned and worried about the future, and you gave me a very comfortable no, that somehow that you didn't live with the anxiety that the apocalypse was coming. And that was one question I wanted to ask you about. I wanted to ask you why you were not concerned. I shouldn't say not concerned and not interested, but why it doesn't affect you.
I won't say it doesn't affect me, but I suppose it's partly because having been in the news business for as long as I have, I tend to take a rather detached view of things as they come along. List comes along, next day it's over, or it isn't over, something else comes along. We just go along, so to speak, from story to story. And you have to, I think, have to keep your personality out of it, your own, I should say your personality, you have to keep your own sentiments out of it. Otherwise you can't do your job. Now, when it comes to worrying about what's going to happen to your children, I am not certain I'm not certain that one can form the world for one's children. I think they tend to do that for themselves as they come along. I also, maybe this is a way of sneaking out, I don't know. But I think when you are in the news business, you have to be detached, you have to be independent. You can't be lined up on one side or the other. If you are, then I think you probably find it impossible to do your job.
But I think that in fact really isn't true, because when Bill Farr got into trouble, then the Fourth Estate was attacked, and everybody in the news business, quite rightly, identified with Bill Farr. And he was doing 6 months the hard way and in the canon. He knew his brothers were out there, and every day it was focused. But Bill Farr got far more coverage and far more attention and far more support than the American Indians did.
Well, there was a question there, of course. Bill Farr was a question of revealing sources.
Yeah.
And he was put in prison because he wouldn't.
Yeah.
And there, I suppose, what you had was a drawing together of people in the news business, protecting one of their own, and as they saw it, perhaps protecting their own interests as news people.
Yeah.
But it's very different from, let us say, taking a position on another issue, an issue like Israel, an issue like Vietnam.
I don't think it's different than an issue than taking. You see, it's quite naturally understood by everybody in the news business. When you go have lunch, you say, well, you know, Bill, the judge made this decision or gave this opinion today in reference to Farr. Now, what that does in reference to the First Amendment, I think it is it the First Amendment? Yeah, the First Amendment. So there was a lot of discussion about it. But when the issue of whether or not Indians have a right to be a people contained within the boundaries of this land, if they have a right to be sovereign, that is not an issue that you hear discussed at lunch. And so when you say that one has to maintain one's objectivity, I don't think that you can. And I think in your heart as a newsman, you naturally will have a disposition and a capacity to identify with what you know and what you're confronted with every day. So that's why people aren't really concerned about Indians.
You're running the risk of getting a lecture from me, which
Good.
which is not at all what this program is about. People in the news business, I will say this as briefly as I can, I believe, operate by stereotypes, which is a point made a very long time ago by Walter Lippmann and probably made long before him, but certainly made by him when he was still a student pretty much and before he became a newspaperman. We operate by stereotypes, which is to say that we tend to look for stories where we are in the habit of finding them. We don't look for them where we're not in the habit of finding them. For that reason, it takes us quite a while to catch up with new stories, or it takes us quite a while to catch up with the fact that a story that is happening should not be interpreted in the same way that a similar story would have been interpreted 5 years before. Let me give you an example. It took quite a long time for news organizations to understand that the war in Vietnam was a very different kind of war from the wars we had been in before. And when we became involved in Vietnam, news coverage of it tended to be much the same in attitude and approach and style as the news coverage we provided during the Second World War. And it took quite a while for it to sink in, that the American servicemen who were there were very different from the American servicemen in the Second World War, that the circumstances in which the war was being fought were quite different, that it was that there were certain weapons, for example, that were merely not appropriate, but which were self-defeating. The use of certain weapons was probably self-defeating in certain circumstances. And it takes a long time for these things to catch up. There's a tired phrase, a cultural lag. Well, in the news business, we suffer from that a great deal. It's one reason we didn't understand very well what was happening on the campuses in the United States at the beginning. It took us some time to catch up with it. For a long time, we didn't understand what was happening among blacks in the United States. It took us a long time to understand that and bring a proper sense of proportion to our judgment of it. That's why we misjudged some people, overestimated them as leaders, underestimated others as leaders. Now, the Indians, because of the history of the United States, including many of the things you were talking about, there's a certain attitude. It's very difficult to change that attitude because everybody, even in the news business, operates on certain assumptions, certain stereotypes. And when you want to change the assumptions that are made about American Indians, thanks to Hollywood, thanks to any number of things, the task is enormous, and there is a built-in resistance to changing it, not necessarily a conscious resistance, but a very real resistance nonetheless. I think that's what I said on the telephone.
I think that's a very useful, I don't think that was a lecture at all. I don't feel like a kid in short pants with a dunce cap on sitting in the corner. It's very helpful to know that, because what you said reinforced something that I believe, and that is that we all have a tendency to be isolated from the world. And there is that lag that you speak of very, very accurately, and that it is a pervasive. That was a lecture at all. I don't feel like a kid in short pants with a dunce cap on sitting in the corner. It's very helpful to know that, because what you said reinforced something that I believe, and that is that we all have a tendency to be isolated from the world. And there is that lag that you speak of very, very accurately, and that it is a pervasive and phenomenal feature of our society. But the dangerous thing that is happening now is that whereas if Spain would go to war with Italy, let's assume, in the 15th century, well, it just took forever to get those boats and the soldiers and those great big, huge, heavy cannons all the way over to Italy and crank them up and blow them off. And there was, of course, the Crusades, which took forever and a day to get going. And now, war is over in a matter of 20 minutes because the missiles aimed at the United States and at Russia and China and wherever else they're going are a matter of, I would say that you could get a war going in a matter of a week's time. Mechanically, you could get it going in a matter of seconds, and it will all be over, I would guess, in a matter of, not 20 seconds, but as long as it takes to push the button and make the phone calls, maybe an hour, it would all be over everywhere. So there is that time lag, and we haven't got the time now because of the intensity of feelings to say, well, let's take a long and leisurely look at things.
But I don't think people perceive any imminent danger, for example, from the American Indian and the apocalyptic vision you have just set out.
There's great danger. I would think there's great danger from the American Indian for a number of reasons. One is because they are less than 1 million people, all told. There is no question in my mind that at Gresham and also at Wounded Knee, they had contingency plans to level the place. And there were some people who wanted to go in and just simply smear it and everybody in it. And I know that from the highest source that one could find. But what is important about the American Indian is the fact that there is a huge reservoir of white people, young people largely, who recognize this as an injustice and who are no longer obliged to militate against the war in Vietnam or be concerned about those issues, because that in some ways has taken care of itself for ill or for good. And there is that reservoir. Now, if we want to start those issues all over again, it's not going to be hard as a result of television shows, as a result of motion pictures we tend to do. It's not hard to get those people involved, but even more importantly, I think, we have to appear in front of the third world as a people who are genuinely concerned about people. And we say we have to live up to our rhetoric, and which means that the OPEC countries, the oil-producing countries, are now saying, wait a minute, we've been at the wrong end of the stick and the short end of the stick for some time now. We're going to form an organization, and we're going to turn the water off and the machinery off and the industrialization off of these nations that are not doing what we want them to do. But since then, there's been the coffee group. There's been a tin group. There's been a rubber group. All these people. Now, supposing all those people got together and said, well, wait a minute, you're not really interested in the American Indian. You really don't give a damn about that. You don't care about these people. You're perfectly willing that they should be expunged from the earth. And genocide is the word that is properly applied to what you are doing and what you have done throughout the history. And as a matter of fact, if you don't come through, we're not going to send our products to your country, and we're going to boycott.
Well, but does not the question arise, if you must talk about this, does not the question arise of whether the coffee people and the tin people and the rubber people and so on are interested in the American Indian? And what reason is there to believe that they're interested in the American Indian, or would base their policy, in particular their sales policy, on what happens to the American Indian?
Very simple response to that is the block voting that you find in the United Nations. Now, we can say in America, oh, hell, we don't care about the United Nations. It's just a talking society, and yes, UNESCO is doing whatever they can do, and UNICEF is helping the children as best they can. But who gives a damn about them? They don't have any power anyhow. But the power, whether it is on the floor of the United Nations or whether it's in the form of a boycott of oil, tin, rubber, chromium, manganese, and whatever else it is, they have the capacity now in the third world to turn our water off, and they are voting in block form in the United Nations and forming a committee, or not a committee, but a group called the Third World, which more and more we find ourselves talking about.
But Marlon, you don't suggest, for example, that Saudi Arabia would decide not to sell us any more oil because what was happening to the Menominee Indians at Gresham, Wisconsin. You can't argue that.
I'm not suggesting that, but what I would like to suggest is that the attitude of the emerging African nations is relevant to, and very precisely to, our attitudes towards black people in this country. And I think one of the very strong impetus, what's the plural of impetus?
Must be impeti.
Impeti, okay, I won't say it.
As in impetigo. But
yeah. One of the very strong reasons why we worked as hard or as we did from the white perspective to correct the situation that was obviously inequitable was because they were looking on. And we know damn well that we don't have to go to England now and France and this country and that country to say, listen, send us the raw materials and we'll make some wonderful things that we'll be able to sell back to the Africans, or you, as a matter of fact. We are now saying that, if you would be kind enough to send the tin over, we could make some tin cans that just would look perfect on your grocery shelves, and because you are making supermarkets over there, and they're wonderful. And I think we've had to pay attention to that.
I suppose we do, but don't you think all those countries are going to act out of self-interest? Isn't that a normal thing to expect?
I think so, but then on the other hand, you have to realize, I think as well, that two guys fighting in a bar are a tougher bunch to take on than one guy, and that 15 guys fighting in a bar makes you consider taking the side door, because you just can't do it. And the OPEC, I think, is the formation of the oil boycott is tells the whole tale, because other countries have seen it work. You see, where there is a lag, in for instance, terrorism, world terrorism. Well, it never came up before. It never made much sense before. But it won't be long before there was a young boy that produced an atom bomb. And I think he came from Harvard or wherever it was, but he was just a student. And they made an experiment, a group of people made an experiment to see whether or not you could produce an atom bomb. So he went to the Library of Congress or wherever he went to, and he got all the stuff together and he produced the bomb. And some reputable scientist said, yeah, this thing will go off. Well, it's not going to be long before they're going to put one in New York City. They've already put gelignite everywhere they can put it in Northern Ireland, and they're calling the tune of the British Army. And that whole thing's going on. So we're really talking about the size of the bomb now. We're not talking about anything else.
Well, certainly the advance of technology makes certain political actions feasible, or semi-military or guerrilla actions feasible that were not feasible before. And in an increasingly complicated and technological society, vulnerability is increased enormously. We've seen that. You could see that in this country, as a matter of fact, during riots, demonstrations, in places like Detroit. It was quite clear that there had been a very considerable change in the conditions in which civil disturbance took place in the United States. I think all of that is true. I think many people drew the lesson from that. If I don't ask you any questions about acting, I'm very likely to lose my job.
Oh, fool you on acting. Acting is a way of life, and
yes.
It's like asking you about sharpening pencils that you write down, the new stuff with. That's not what we're faced with. That's what, that's what sells the shekels and perhaps makes the program less dry and less refined and less of a tincture of...
Well, maybe so, but you've been quoted as saying, for example, anybody can act. It isn't true, is it?
Of course it's true. You just said yourself. I said, was that you didn't laugh at that, and you said I smirked. And
that's
then
a rather narrow range of acting.
Yeah, and then you said I only smirk on camera, or you didn't say I only smirk on camera. You said the camera wasn't on me anyway. So I said, well, does your smirk improve when the camera's on you? But if your secretary has a really awful perfume, which she doesn't have, by the way.
Is she here?
But if she came in with some awful perfume and she said, how do you like this perfume? It comes from the Granada Hills in East Turkey, and it was made from goat's ears, and it's cost $1,000 an ounce, and it was given to me. Isn't it wonderful? You would say, well, it certainly is. But you would very carefully avoid having her see your eyes roll towards heaven and think, my God, do I have to smell this squirrel manure for the entire day? And Jesus, what's going to happen if it goes on week after week? I can't stand that smell. So you're acting for your life there. You can't say, honey, your perfume really stinks. I mean, it's in just the used jockstrap department, and that's all I can say to you. So in that respect, we're all actors. Whether you limp or speak with an accent while you're saying, honey, your perfume is just wonderful. It's really wonderful. Or when you have to go to dinner with somebody who you don't want to go to, or you feel awful, you've had an awful day, and you've had some fights here and some arguments there, and you didn't get what you wanted, and something else happened. And you have to go out with to dinner with some people. It's important for you to have dinner with these people. You're going to go out and show them a good time. And you're not going to let them see your anguish or your irritation or your frustration or your fatigue. And you're going to act for your supper. And everybody does that. I mean, the guy with his shoes in his hand sneaking upstairs because he's been out with some broad after the office party, and his wife says, what are you doing? He said, I was concerned about the car, because I thought I heard somebody rattling around down there. I took my shoes off, and I think we got a prowler. And he's thinking on his feet. He's trying to think of any excuse, and of course his wife nailed him with perfume and lipstick, or whatever it is. So that's, as much as there is to say about that. But I think it's important to say something about Indian law and how little we know about it, and how on the Pine Ridge Reservation today, the people get shot all the time. You don't read about it because they don't put it in the newspapers. You don't hear it on the show, on the news, because they don't send it in. But there is no law and order on the Pine Ridge Reservation and many other reservations. Or there is a corrupt kind of order which the American government has arranged through the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, has to approve everything. They say, okay, breathe in, now breathe out. They breathe in and breathe out. And it was an absurd way of saying that the Bureau of Indian Affairs controls everything an Indian does in his life. And the Indians are doing everything they can to get up off their knees, to reinstate themselves, to help themselves. And people think in terms of cliche, and coming back to that word lag, there is a lag. People think that Indians are people who are wards of the government and get a government check and go out and buy a bottle of booze and lay back and drink it. That's the cliche. And that is the kind of propaganda that is perpetuated by the land-interested people, the real estate people, the ranchers, the sheepmen, the water people, all the lobbyists, God, there's so many of them, the mineral people. They all want to say that the Indian is this or that and the other thing. And these people are fighting for their lives, and the only reason that they weren't shot was because they have such a high silhouette around the country. Now, we can, blow the SLA away and set the house on fire and remove them, and they're white. And we can go into Attica, and Rockefeller can say, blow them away. We've got to have law and order. Well, in terms of law, there's never been a judicious application of the phenomenon of law in respect to Indians. Never. And these recent decisions that are coming out, there are some, Judge Bolt, for instance, in Washington, made a favorable decision in respect to Indians. In the Lakota tribe, the judge that, I can't remember his name, federal judge that handled that, made a favorable decision on the issue of the Power Commission, whether the Power Commission had right over the Indian reservation. Now, but Judge Urbaum, of course, ducked the whole issue, as most judges are doing, and they're saying that it is the legislation. Now, let me ask you a question. If you are a Jew in Germany, and there is legislation that is passed, legal legislation, it comes from the Nazi Party and says, this is it. And as a judge, you have sworn to uphold the laws of the land, and it says that every Jew has to wear a yellow star, and this particular Jew comes in front of you, and he says, I will not wear a yellow star, and I will not have any German representation. I refuse it, and it is an illegal law. It is an immoral law. What are you going to do? Are you going to say, yeah, that's illegal, it's unconstitutional, it's inhuman, and I won't uphold the law? Well, that's the extreme view. There were some judges who went to concentration camps because they simply would not uphold the law. Maybe 4 out of I don't know how many judges. Most of them said, you have to put a yellow star on because that's the law, and not only is it the law, but it's a correct law. And there are some other judges snuck out and suddenly got a cold, or they had to go into a teaching seminar or something like that. And that's what the justices in America are doing, simply because they reflect the time. You see, you as reporter, I as an actor. I mean, there was a time when we were trotted around and trotted out whenever Louis B. Mayer thought it was right that they should pull the actor out and show him off, and then he was put away in his case and brushed off and kept clean and watered and fed, and those days are gone. And it's now a time for you and I both to make personal commitments to what the world is that we live in, or not, as we follow our individual philosophical dispositions.
Well, you must be swamped with requests to help in various causes. Obviously, at the moment, you are very much devoted to the cause of the American Indian. But how do you decide which ones are worthy of your time? Well, maybe you think many of them are worthy of your time. How do you decide which ones you can actually give time to?
Well, rightly or wrongly, it's a question of priority. If we cannot solve the problem of the American Indian, if we cannot make our constitutional concepts, if we cannot equitably apply them to the American Indian, if we cannot see justice done to the American Indians with the help of the insight of Senator Aberesk and this re-examination of American Indian policy, then if we cannot solve that problem, then how in the hell are we going to solve the problem of the SALT talks, the Middle East, the differences between communism versus capitalism? There's no way to do that. If we can't solve the problem of human aggression as we experience it and see it and have had it enacted in our history, then there isn't really much hope for something fancy.
A few weeks ago, you appeared at a rock concert, which was trying to raise money. I think it did raise some money for the sports program in San Francisco high schools.
Yeah.
Because I think the money was no longer forthcoming from the city government.
Yeah.
There were about 60,000 people in attendance. You were the only person who appeared before them who was not a rock musician.
No, there were
some others.
There were baseball players and I think a football player and some other people.
What did you say? What were you doing there?
What I said was that if we all don't hang together, we're going to hang separately, because it's all rushing down on us. I didn't say that precisely, but that it was an historical event. I'm sure you've read Marshall McLuhan's books, and this machine, this television machine, is far more powerful than bombs. It's far more powerful than anything we've experienced, because it has turned us into a group of villagers again. We remember the time. I'm 50. How old are you?
I thought you were 51 today. Is that not
That's
correct?
right. By God, that's right. Somebody called me up this morning and said, "Your happy birthday." I'd forgotten about it. And then that's...
Well, not to be evasive, I'm 56.
Yeah, okay. But we remember a time when there was such a thing as the hick. We remember a time when the Northeast was different than the Southeast. And the pattern of accents has changed now. The pattern of behavior, the pattern of regionalism has gone simply because of the television. And so whatever happens now, whatever happens, let's say, in Pretoria, South Africa, happens in Nome, Alaska. Whatever happens in Helsinki happens in Australia because of this machine. And the rock group people are more important in this world. Well, you see the results of the Beatles. The Beatles transformed cultures. They transformed values. They set precedent. And they produced the phrase uniculture, because they brought the sitar. Nobody ever heard of the sitar, and they used it. And the Maharishi Mahesh, nobody ever knew about him or knew about Indian philosophy, but they served as sort of a catalytic agent to bring all these disparate elements together. And we hope, those of us who are interested in, there's Bob Dylan, for instance, who was a man who was predicted what was going to happen in his songs, in Blowing in the Wind. And I remember one phrase, a song, I think the name of it is Mr. Jones, but he says, "Something is happening, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones?" He's addressing the hick. He's addressing those of us who put blinders on and want to do our everyday chores. But what is happening was articulated by Dylan. And they are the makers. They are the shakers and the movers of this world. And they don't realize their own power, and hopefully we can join together, to join hands, to bring about the information that is not known to people as a result of their efforts.
I suppose what I might do here is sit here and read a lot of questions I was going to ask you that I never got to ask you about acting or directing. That is just something you think is not worth discussing.
It's totally irrelevant. That survival is the thing that we have to address ourselves to. Whether you're an actor, or a baker, a candlestick maker, is meaningless.
May I ask you a question that is relevant to what you've been talking about, but is a personal one? Is it true that at one time you were thinking of entering the ministry, the Protestant ministry?
No, when I was very young and struggling to find a solution to the existential problems that we all face. I delved into yogi, into Heinrich Zimmer's views on Indian religion, and read a lot of books that I didn't understand, and investigated various aspects of religion, and but I never thought really of going into it.
This story that your parents talked you out of it is
No,
quite wrong.
no. God, no.
They didn't try to talk you into it.
No, they didn't do that either.
How far did you? This is really time only for one more question. How far did you go in the formal education that you obviously feel was so inadequate?
I went to a military school called Shattuck Military School, and I had it was very useful because I was thrown out of that school. They never caught me. I used to somehow, being a social actor, caught me. I used to take paper clips and I'd stick them in the locks, and then I'd work them back and forth and break them off so they couldn't get into the classrooms. And they'd have to have the locksmith. By that time, the class would be over. So, but they never caught me at it, although somebody made a wise decision and kicked me out. And that was my high school. I left as a sophomore in high school as a dropout. But I immediately went to the New School of Social Research, and I'm very happy to say that it's come full round that I met Mr. Heilbronner.